So a lot of these warrants were from before Bryan Kohberger was actually a suspect. There were about 62 different documents out there that we went through the other night, and many of them repeated. You can see here this Apple list. There's 4 different Apple accounts. And so essentially what they did is they executed warrants on the victims. They were looking into their backgrounds as much as possible. They were looking at their bank records, their phone records. They also executed quite a few warrants around their social media accounts. They had to submit those warrants in order to legally get that information from these companies. All of these companies were cooperative and followed up pretty quick. Essentially, a lot of these warrants were just them digging into the digital data, digging into what we would expect them to do in this case, and try to look into their backgrounds, look for any kind of record that they could follow up on that looked unusual. And they definitely looked into their social media, things like Facebook, Snapchat, Tinder. They looked at those accounts very closely, and it appeared that in some of those warrants, they actually had a list of potentially user IDs, in my opinion, that they were probably looking for any connections to the victims. And I think this was before Bryan was actually a suspect in the case. So in addition to the social media background checks and kind of digging into all of that on the victims, they also served some warrants on Verizon, AT&T, and those were for the cell phone towers. And they needed to use those warrants in order to get the information that those cell phone pings and the towers would have recorded. It's all just kind of the legal process here of getting the information that they needed as they were investigating the case. And I think a lot of that we kind of assume was happening anyway. They did do a very deep investigation on K-Bar. So they submitted quite a few warrants looking for records and sales of K-Bar knives. Now, this doesn't mean that they actually have receipts. We don't know. They might have found a receipt. They might have found a purchase record, but we don't know at this point. As far as from these documents here, we do know, though, that they were serving warrants on K-Bar, on Walmart, on Amazon, and then there was a retail store called Blue Ridge Knives. And from what I can tell, they're pretty much a wholesaler of knives. So they sell large bulk quantity, large numbers of knives go through Blue Ridge Knives. So it's possible that they were connected to K-Bar in some way, and they were some sort of dealer, and they connected Blue Ridge Knives to K-Bar. But it was interesting that Blue Ridge Knives was specifically noted there, and we wonder if there could be something they found through their records. So in addition to the warrants, looking for kind of these pieces of evidence, they also had a few orders to seal in here, and specifically an order to seal the Coeur d'Alene forensic results, and also from the Moscow Police Department. They had some forensic findings, and they submitted orders to seal those so that we don't know what they found from that information. And then one thing that I really thought was interesting was there was a warrant for UPS, and they were looking for video footage from any UPS trucks that evening when the crimes occurred. So I'm wondering if maybe there's, I don't know how closely they track UPS trucks GPS wise, but maybe there's some knowledge out there for some reason that they're asking for the UPS video footage. Maybe a UPS driver came forward and said, yeah, I saw a white car drive past me when I was driving my route early on in the morning. It was interesting to me, right, that UPS showed up there. What would lead law enforcement to that? Or is that just standard protocol? Do they just go to UPS? Why not FedEx, right? Why didn't we see one that says we went to FedEx and looked for their video footage, just UPS? So was there maybe a UPS driver out there who saw a Whitey Lantra pass by at some point? Everybody, let me know what you think about that. Put a 1 in the comments if you think that a UPS driver may have seen Bryan, and put a 2 in the comments if you think it might just be standard protocol that they would just be looking into that anyway. And if you have any other thoughts, put that in there as well. I'm going to keep an eye on that. So in addition to the UPS warrant, which I thought was very interesting, they also had an order to seal WSU information. And I do really think that that WSU information that they're sealing might be some complaints that were filed by students against Bryan. I'm sure that they submitted a warrant to WSU for records and things like that. And, you know, they obviously were having some conversations with Bryan, and there was a disciplinary process happening in his employment position, and they would document that, right? So those records would be on file at WSU. All right, so I have to ask the twos in the comments there, if it's standard protocol, how come they wouldn't look for FedEx video footage? Wouldn't there be FedEx trucks early in the morning similar to UPS? Let me know what you think about that. So Mike C says he thinks maybe a delivery from UPS. So interesting. And then Just Me says there was a package room in a building near where he spent 9 minutes before heading to the house. Could he have maybe stopped and picked up a delivery? Interesting. I think it did say it was looking for video footage from a truck. So I wonder if maybe there was a route that they wanted to check. I know they were looking for any kind of footage they could get, whether there was something on it or not. And I think maybe that could also, you know, if you think about, you know, when he was fleeing the scene, they mentioned in the warrant, they had him on video at some points, but then they also didn't have him on video in some places where they had cameras. So they're able to eliminate, right, where he would have been and say, okay, well, maybe we didn't see him on camera somewhere, but we didn't see him here, and they can narrow down his path that way. So maybe with the UPS video footage, they can eliminate his path, right? This was early on in the case, right? This information they were looking for was early on, and they were probably still trying to figure out what his route was. They may not have had, right, that cell phone data yet, so the UPS data would have made sense to look for to see if, okay, if there is video footage, at least we know he wasn't there. In my opinion, what I think was the most interesting piece of information was Bryan's Yik Yak information. So that warrant was actually issued, let me get this back for you. That warrant was actually issued after Bryan's arrest. And so they were looking for this Yik Yak information. Let me show you that here. And I think that they may have found the app on his phone, the Yik Yak app on his phone after he was arrested. Let me know what you think about that. Just to make it easy for everybody, put a 1 if you think they found the app on the phone. Put a comment if you think otherwise. But I'm wondering if maybe, you know, after he was arrested, they checked his phone, they saw this Yik Yak app, and then they filed this, because this was on, you can see on January 25th, the search warrant was obtained. And everybody, Yik Yak, if you didn't catch it in the other video, this is an app that it's very actually popular with college students, even high school students. But you're able to send anonymous messages through Yik Yak within a 5-mile radius of where you're at. So you're only communicating with people who are close, in a somewhat close vicinity to you. And from what I've read about this, is it's pretty popular with college students. And it's also popular with people who move into new areas, trying to kind of find and connect with people. At least that's how they market it. And this app actually was around back in 2013, I believe, and then they shut down for a while because they were having a lot of problems with harassment and things like that on the app. And then they've just recently come back since 2017. Yik Yak kind of came back, and so they've been back around again. But that's what Yik Yak is. So I really think that they probably seized his phone when he was arrested, saw this app on his phone, and then were checking into that account to see what they could find. Wow, that's interesting, Jewel. Thanks for letting me know about that. I don't know. I mean, you know, those other cases that I made those videos about, it's interesting to me because, you know, there's either answer, you know, whether it's related to Bryan or not is kind of disturbing, right? If it is related to Bryan, well, that makes sense because they are so similar. Just the way that they happened. If you look at all of some of the details, how those crimes unfolded, and compare it to this case, there's a lot of similarities there. You know, when you talk about the early morning hours, there's reports of somebody wearing a mask. These attacks are very violent with a knife. There's no robbery. There's no SA. They're kind of sneaking into homes while people are sleeping and attacking them in their sleep. There's cases, you know, if you look at with the Juten case, you have a male and a female in the home, and so there doesn't seem to be a fear of encountering a male, right? Where, you know, where this person's going into the home, and who knows who the target is in those cases. But if they were attacking Jamie Lynn, for example, in that Juten case, you know, you have a male there very similar to Ethan and Xana. So there's so many similarities there. Then you have the Sandra Ladd case, you know, up there in Washington, and she was attacked in the middle of the night while she was sleeping as well. You know, we don't really have as much evidence on those cases and what happened. They haven't really released much, which is interesting in itself. You know, we don't know this. You know, Jamie Lynn especially, she probably made a very thorough statement to law enforcement about what happened and described the attacker. She probably got a pretty decent look at the person. So who knows? This case is sealed. Who knows if they are looking into that? They did say early on that they felt like it wasn't connected, but they never really tell us the truth in that you know, all the time either. I was talking about the UPS video warrant, and I really think that's interesting that they don't have FedEx or DHL, another delivery service. I'm wondering if they may have had a witness report who said they may have seen a white Elantra passing by while they were heading out for their delivery, you know, at 4:30 in the morning. Why would they be asking specifically for UPS video footage? All right, here's the warrant back there, Parker. So here's the Yik Yak warrant. So they were looking for the unique user ID that is assigned by Yik Yak, registration date and time for the accounts, registration IP address of the accounts. Just pretty much anything from Yik Yak, I would imagine. They want all of that data. So let's jump over. I want to show you now really quick the this other clue that I found, and I want to talk about that a little bit more because I want to hear what everybody thinks about this as well. So when you go to this mycourts.idaho.gov website, this is where all those warrants are. If you do want to read through those more, I will link this in the description below. But you can search here for any other records. And when I initially had come in here, I'd searched Bryan's name, and if you go here and you try to pull it up through his name, it doesn't come up for whatever reason. And I tried it multiple ways, and you know, each time same thing. You know, I tried typing it without the comma, with the comma here. So luckily the first time I did this, it came up for whatever reason. I had a screenshot of it and I had the case number, so I ran it by the case number and that pulled it up here. So this is going to be the reason that Bryan would have been pulled over on the night of August 21st, 2022. So this was noted in the warrant early on about Bryan when they were talking about he was stopped on August 21st, and I think he was also stopped on October 14th of 2022, kind of later in the evening. And I know I was wondering what those stops were for, and I really want to see the body cam footage of those stops. I really hope eventually we can see that and see that conversation that happened with that police officer and Bryan Kohberger. I think one of these stops was probably around 11:30 at night, so I'm wondering what that conversation was. But here we have the reason that he was pulled over that night, at least. And there's a couple things here that I do think are interesting, and I want to share that, and then I'm going to keep an eye on the comments to hear what you think. So here we have the case information. Here's the case ID. File date was 8/22 because he was pulled over on 8/21, so this would have been turned in, I'm sure, you know, and processed on 8/22. It was late at night on 8/21 when he was encountered. And look, this is the first thing that stood out to me is we have the prosecutor here, who's the same prosecutor who's on this case. Let me zoom in for you a little bit on this some more. See if that helps. So we have the same prosecutor. You know, it's a small town in Moscow, so he's probably on a lot of documents, but that caught my eye. You know, this isn't the first time that this person has seen Bryan's name on some paperwork. But you can see here, this is Bryan Kohberger. It was for case number CR 2922-1911. And then up here, you can see here, this case status is failure to appear. So that's something I want to circle back on here in just a minute. But failure to appear. Now, this isn't a big deal. This is a ticket that Bryan got. But the failure to appear is interesting. And let's go down here. So Bryan, the charge was vehicle safety restraint failed to use. So most likely Bryan was not wearing his seatbelt when he was driving on August 21st late at night, and he was pulled over by law enforcement. Okay, and then you can see here there's kind of a list of how this case unfolded. So we had the new case that was filed on 8/22. Prosecutor was assigned, the same prosecutor that's now prosecuting Bryan for murder. And then we have the citation was filed. And then down here, there was a default judgment. So from what I can tell, Bryan didn't show up at court for the ticket. He signed the ticket. He didn't show up. Now, we don't know. Did he forget about it? He didn't pay the ticket, and he didn't show up at court. But he ended up just paying a $10 fine here for not wearing his seatbelt, and then they closed the case. And this is pretty common. A minor infraction like this, you sign the ticket, and they expect you're going to take care of it. It's a $10. It's some people call it a fix-it ticket, and similar to like, okay, if you have a tail light out, they just kind of give you a ticket, and you just have to get that tail light fixed. It's a pretty small fee. So in this case, there's this failure to appear. And so Bryan probably just didn't show up for whatever that court date was 30 days later after the infraction. And so that triggered, that to show up in the case, this failure to appear infraction default. So the couple of things here that I wanted to hear people's thoughts on were, when we think about Bryan and him committing this murder and why he would commit the murder and what his mindset would have been when he did these things, and it's tough to figure out. It seems like he would have been pretty sharp when it comes to committing crimes, yet he made all these mistakes. He had a lot of things going for him, but he threw it all away kind of, to commit this murder. So you wonder about, what was he thinking? What would have made him do those things? And then, there's that survey that he had posted that some people have talked about. He was kind of curious about what it was like to commit a crime and what people thought and felt when they were committing crimes. And so with Bryan, it seems like he almost has, and then I look back at some of the other research on him where, we connected him to that YouTube account with the beats to plan your crimes to, and kind of listening to that music that kind of glorifies crime in general. And then here we have Bryan, driving late at night, and he's not wearing his seatbelt. And maybe I'm a nerd, but I wear my seatbelt, and I feel weird if I don't. And I feel like, I'm sure there's people out there who just don't wear their seatbelt. I've heard of that. But in general, most people wear their seatbelt because it makes sense for safety. But we have Bryan, he's driving and he's getting this infraction for not wearing his seatbelt. And so you think about kind of the psychology behind that, and you think about, his mindset and his attitude in general towards crime and following the rules. We also have Bryan seems to have a problem with authority, right? With these disciplinary things happening at his work and at his school. They're having these conversations about how he's interacting with people, and it sounds like he's having conflict with the professor as well. And so it seems like Bryan has this kind of issue with, I don't know if it's authority or with law or following the rules, but at the same time, he's kind of following this field. And it's just interesting to me that he would be driving late at night without his seatbelt on, and then even the failure to appear, right? He doesn't bother to show up, right? So it's almost kind of like this lack of responsibility. And then when you talk about him committing these murders, and maybe that coming from that mindset of, he thinks he doesn't have to follow law, he doesn't care about it. He's kind of this kind of wannabe criminal per se. He wants to experience crime. He wants to be that kind of tough guy, and he's living out that fantasy in his mind, So I really think, with trying to figure out why Bryan would have done what he did so impulsively and done what he did in general, we don't know his motive, but when you look at his mindset, you see kind of a pattern here with this kind of fascination with crime and committing crime and being a criminal almost, I've listened to that YouTube channel with the music with that beats to plan your crimes to, and I can just imagine, there's that long drive Bryan did before and after the murders where he kind of took the long way to get to the house, and I just imagine him listening, to this music and kind of like thinking through his head and just kind of living out this fantasy of like he's a tough, badass, doesn't have to follow the law, he's smarter than everybody, kind of that narcissist personality that he has. But it's just interesting to me that we just see in a minor infraction like this, just his careless attitude, with not wearing a seatbelt, not showing up to court. You wonder, what is he thinking through all this? So this actually led me to kind of thinking more about Bryan when he was younger, and there's that talk about Bryan's heroin use. And I do think that this is something that could be playing a part in why Bryan did some of the things he did and why Bryan is the way he is. Using heroin, especially at a young age like Bryan did, I mean, he was still a teenager. That's definitely going to affect you in a long-term way. And I was reading about it a little bit, and without getting too deep into the psychology of it, and it essentially affects the frontal cortex of your brain, and it has to do with your decision making and kind of your impulse control, all of these things that we've been talking about with Bryan. And the more I look at this, the more I kind of see this pattern of this drug use early on in his life may have started contributing toward this kind of twisted mindset that he has now. You combine this lifestyle that he had when he was in high school, and then you watch the way he progresses into this crime environment and learning about crime and criminology and then psychology and delving into trying to understand the mind. So you kind of see this evidence of him struggling to understand, maybe some of these internal conflicts and latching on to this field, and studying it for the next 6 years. And then, he's just unstable because of all of these things from earlier in his life. But essentially, when you talk about heroin use and the effect on the brain, you can see that, just to summarize it here, is individuals with heroin addiction are prone to dysfunctional decision making. And I've really been racking my brain about Bryan and, why would he be so stupid in some of the stuff that he would have done? Why did he do what he did? If there were SA involved in the case, well, that would explain it, right? He was attracted to maybe one of the victims, but in this case, there's not. There's no robbery. There's no SA. This is almost kind of like an anger type of crime where he's lashing out, and it's almost like this unfeeling type of, above the law attitude that he's going to get away with it in this high traffic area. It's very interesting to me what his mindset was, and so I've been really trying to figure that out. And looking at this heroin background, I really think that this has something to do with why he would have just been making the mistakes he made and just have been so impulsive in what he did. He may have planned it, right? He may have fantasized about it in his mind and planned through the act of the crime, the actual crime, but who knows how much of the actual planning he did of the actual crime of covering it up, because he made so many mistakes. So maybe he was more focused on just the act of what he wanted to do, and he was so focused on that. Maybe there was drug use involved, right, when he went there that night that clouded his judgment. But I don't know if he necessarily thought through all of the details on how to get away with the crime. He took some basic steps. He took the long way around. He turned off his phone. But then he drives up when there's video cameras there to catch him. He leaves a knife sheath, all these other pieces of evidence. Even the, wearing gloves in his house that we've heard about recently, where he's putting his trash in baggies. It's kind of ridiculous at this point. What is he doing? He's putting it in baggies because he thinks they're looking for his trash? What does he think? Does he not think that they're going to find the baggies in the trash? He's actually preserving it for law enforcement. He's packaging it up for them in little Ziploc baggies and putting it in his neighbor's trash, saying, "Here, I separated it for you." it's just kind of a ridiculous thing to be doing. And we don't even know if that's true either. We don't know if he was even doing that. You know, some of those reports I kind of doubt. There was one expert who was talking about that, and he said that, well, that explains why they weren't finding Bryan's DNA in the trash in the days before that. And I don't know, but I thought it took more than a couple days in order to get DNA results back. So that wouldn't make sense, right? That they checked the trash yesterday and then they got a DNA result back the next day saying, oh yeah, none of that's Bryan's DNA. So just that statement alone didn't make sense to me. But again, when you talk about Bryan doing some of these things in the crime, it's like, what is he thinking? What's going on there? It's just, this is, I think, what makes this case so curious, you know, and trying to figure it out. It's just kind of like you look over here, he's this PhD criminology expert, but then look over here and he's the worst criminal ever as far as leaving evidence behind. So everybody, we recapped the warrants. We talked about why Bryan got pulled over on the night of August 21st. He was out late at night. I think he was probably in Moscow, probably in the area. They might have more cell phone pings showing where he was a little more specifically. But he was actually pulled over right near the highway. So if he were exiting Moscow and about to get on the road to head back to Pullman, that's where he was pulled over. He wasn't pulled over, just to clarify, he wasn't pulled over right next to the house or anything like that. This was probably probably about a 5-minute drive away from where the house was where Bryan was pulled over on August 21st. So everybody, I want to thank you for joining me. It's Sunday night. I'm going to let everybody go so you can get some rest before the week starts. I will be posting some videos this week, so keep an eye out. I really appreciate everybody joining. Please hit that like button for me. It helps get more people visibility into seeing the video. And if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. I really appreciate it. I'll be making another video very soon, so I'll see you all then. Thank you so much.